Adriana Blackwood traced the frayed cuff of her worn jacket, a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Every day was a relentless balancing act. Early childhood education classes squeezed between a diner shift, a few hours tutoring, and the constant nagging fear of her undocumented status. One wrong step, one missed paycheck, and the precarious life she'd painstakingly built could crumble, leaving her on the streets. All she craved was stability, a quiet corner of the world where she could control her own destiny, where fear wasn't a constant companion. Then she saw the ad online, a small beacon of impossible hope amidst the endless listings for shared rooms and temporary gigs. Live-in nanny position, secluded Hudsonside mansion, excellent remuneration. It felt like a trap, too perfect to be real, yet the desperation for a steady income, for a roof over her head that wasn't borrowed or rented by the week, pushed her to reply. The address led her far up the river, past sprawling estates and manicured lawns, until a set of towering iron gates, intricately wrought and undeniably formidable, loomed into view. She gave her name to an unseen speaker, and with a low hydraulic sigh, the gates swung inward. The gravel driveway stretched for what felt like miles, winding through ancient trees before opening onto a sight that stole her breath. The mansion wasn't merely large, it was a fortress, built of dark stone and glass, sprawling against the backdrop of the Hudson River. It exuded an unyielding power, a silent declaration of wealth and control that made Adriana feel impossibly small, like a stray leaf blown in from the street. Her simple interview dress suddenly felt painfully inadequate, her worn shoes a stark contrast to the polished perfection of her surroundings. Inside, the air was cool, hushed, and held the faint scent of expensive leather and something metallic, like polished steel. A stern-faced housekeeper led her through a grand foyer, past marble floors that gleamed under soft, recessed lighting. Then he was there. Roman Russo. He stood by a large window overlooking the river, his back to her, a silhouette of immense power. When he turned, Adriana felt the air around her grow heavy, pressed down by his sheer presence. He was taller than she'd imagined, broad-shouldered, with a lean, dangerous grace. His dark suit seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin, accentuating the raw strength in his frame. His face was a chiseled mask, dark eyes sweeping over her with an intensity that made her want to shrink away. He didn't offer a hand, didn't smile. His gaze was cold, assessing, as if she were an object being weighed, measured and found, insignificant. "You're Adriana Blackwood," he stated, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet room, a sound of absolute command. It wasn't a question but a declaration. She simply nodded, her throat suddenly dry. She felt a primal instinct to obey, to simply do whatever he expected, because in his presence, choice seemed to evaporate. He barely spared her another glance, turning back to the window, dismissing her as quickly as he'd acknowledged her. The power difference between them was a tangible force, a chasm she knew she could never bridge. A moment later, a small boy emerged from a nearby room, clutching a well-worn plush lion to his chest. He had wide, solemn eyes and a quiet shyness that immediately tugged at Adriana's heart. This was Leo, the child she was to care for. He looked up at her, then at Roman, then back at her, a silent question in his gaze. Adriana knelt, offering a gentle smile. "Hello, Leo," she whispered, her voice soft, a stark contrast to the formidable man who stood silently by the window. The boy didn't speak, but he leaned slightly into her offered hand, his small fingers brushing her sleeve. In that moment, Adriana felt a fierce, tender rush of protectiveness, a feeling that eclipsed her unease about Roman and his imposing mansion. This child needed her. She looked at Leo, then back at Roman's unyielding profile, then at the vast, impenetrable walls of the mansion. The job felt impossibly dangerous, fraught with unspoken warnings. Yet the thought of the stability it promised, the security for Leo, outweighed the creeping shadow of fear that Roman Russo cast. She took the job, knowing she was stepping into a world utterly beyond her control, but clinging to the whisper of hope that it would finally offer her and this quiet boy a safe harbor. The first few days melted into a fragile routine, surprisingly gentle after the initial shock of the mansion's grandeur and Roman's forbidding presence. Adriana found her rhythm in the quiet hum of the house, in Leo's soft questions and the easy way he fit his small hand into hers. She read him stories in a sun-drenched playroom, helped him with his simple lessons, and supervised his meals. Leo, initially shy, slowly began to open up, his solemn eyes occasionally sparkling with a childish mischief that made Adriana's heart ache with a tender affection. He still clutched his worn plush lion, but now sometimes he'd offer it to her to hold, a silent gesture of trust. One afternoon, the sun was a warm blanket on their shoulders as they explored a secluded corner of the mansion's vast gardens. Leo chased a butterfly, his laughter, light as chime bells, drifting through the air. Adriana watched him, a rare, uncomplicated sense of peace settling over her. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about bills, about her status, about the precariousness of her existence. She was simply present, a nanny watching her charge, feeling a quiet joy bloom within her. Then the world shattered. A sharp crack echoed through the garden, followed by another and another. Gunshots. The sound was alien, brutal, ripping through the gentle afternoon. Adriana's blood ran cold. Instinct took over, swift and absolute. Before her mind could process the danger, her body moved. "Leo!" she cried, a raw sound ripped from her throat. She dove forward, sweeping the small boy into her arms, twisting to shield him. The world became a blur of terror, the harsh scent of gunpowder, the sharp thwack of something hitting a nearby tree, Leo's small body trembling violently against hers. She curled around him, a desperate, vulnerable barrier, her arms wrapped tight, praying her meager frame would be enough. She felt a profound, animalistic terror, not for herself, but for the precious life she was holding. Suddenly, a shadow fell over them, not the soft shadow of a cloud, but something vast and dangerous, Roman. He moved with the terrifying efficiency of a predator, appearing from nowhere, a dark blur of motion. His voice, usually a low rumble, was now a guttural command, slicing through the chaos. Men in black suits seemed to materialize around him, their movements precise, their faces grim. The sounds of combat escalated, and then, just as suddenly, began to recede. The world outside Adriana's huddle with Leo was a maelstrom of controlled violence, a symphony of brutal precision orchestrated by Roman. She heard shouts, the sharp reports of firearms, and then a profound, chilling silence descended. Her body still shook, a deep tremor that refused to subside. Leo was whimpering, buried against her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to make sense of the nightmare. When she finally dared to look up, Roman stood over them, towering, immense. His dark eyes, usually cold, now burned with an intensity that stole her breath. There was no fear in them, only a searing, absolute fury that seemed directed at the world, at the audacity of anyone who dared to threaten what was his. His gaze swept over Leo, a flicker of something unreadable, then locked onto Adriana. His voice, when he spoke, was low, stripped of all warmth, yet held a terrifying weight. "You will never leave this mansion again, Adriana." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a declaration, an immutable law spoken into existence. The air around her solidified, trapping her. Her breath hitched. The words were a physical blow, yet beneath the shock, a strange, perverse sense of safety began to unfurl. He wasn't asking. He was commanding. He was taking control. And in the face of such raw, overwhelming power, her own will seemed to falter, replaced by a nascent instinct to simply obey. As if to punctuate his decree, a heavy metallic groan reverberated through the air. Adriana turned her head, her gaze drawn beyond the trees, past the glimpse of the river. The formidable iron security gates, the same ones that had swung open to admit her, were now slowly, inexorably clanging shut. They sealed her new fate, echoing with a finality that made her shiver. She was inside, and she would not be getting out. Not ever. The clanging echo of the iron gates shutting resonated not just through the vast grounds of the mansion, but deep within Adriana's bones. It was a sound of absolute finality, severing her from the world she knew, from any semblance of the life she desperately fought to control. Her initial shock gave way to a cold, burning indignation. This couldn't be happening. She was not a prisoner. She found Roman in his study, a cavernous room filled with dark wood and the hushed weight of authority. He stood by his desk, a formidable figure in the imposing space, his presence filling every corner. She felt impossibly small, yet a spark of defiance, fueled by years of fighting for her own survival, refused to be extinguished. "You can't do this," she stated, her voice trembling slightly but firm. She tried to project an authority she didn't feel, standing straighter, meeting his unyielding gaze. "You can't just lock me in. I have rights. I have a life. You have no right to control me." Roman's eyes, dark and fathomless, regarded her without a flicker of emotion. He didn't move, didn't raise his voice, yet the sheer force of his stillness was more intimidating than any outburst. "Your life out there, Adriana, guarantees your death," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate the very air around them. It was calm, devoid of anger, yet held an immutable certainty that chilled her to the core. "You are no longer just a nanny. You are a witness. You are a target. Stepping outside these walls ensures the rival cartel will find you, and they will not be gentle." He paused, letting his words sink in, the unspoken weight of his world pressing down on her. "Here," he continued, his gaze sweeping around the opulent room, then back to her, encompassing the entire mansion. "You are untouchable. You are safe. That is my declaration." His words weren't a negotiation, they were a decree. She felt the stark truth of it, a cold, undeniable reality settling over her. Her small acts of rebellion, her insistence on autonomy, felt childish and futile against the backdrop of the violence she had witnessed just hours ago. He wasn't asking for her agreement. He was stating a fact, a new law that applied only to her. The next few days blurred into a strange, unsettling rhythm. The mansion, once a symbol of impossible luxury, became a gilded cage. Every window, every door, every path outside was now a barrier. She saw the guards, not just men in suits, but silent, watchful shadows at every turn, their presence a constant reminder of her confinement. The security cameras were discreet but omnipresent, a silent, unblinking eye that followed her movements. The air, once merely hushed, now felt heavy with an unspoken vigilance. She moved through the vast rooms, a captive in a palace, the weight of her lost freedom pressing down. Yet, amidst her frustration, she couldn't deny the pervasive sense of security. The world outside had been chaos and terror. Inside, Roman had created an impenetrable bubble. It was a perverse comfort, knowing that every lock, every guard, every silent, watchful gaze was there to protect her. She watched Roman from a distance, particularly when he was with Leo. The boy, still clutching his worn plush lion, seemed to be the only one who could soften the hard lines of Roman's formidable presence. She saw the quiet patience in Roman's eyes as Leo showed him a drawing, the gentle way Roman would sometimes brush Leo's hair from his forehead. There was a fierce, unwavering protectiveness in him when it came to his son, a dedication that mirrored the same intensity he now directed at her. One afternoon, she wandered into the enormous, state-of-the-art kitchen, feeling a restless energy she couldn't dispel. On the industrial-sized stainless steel refrigerator, amidst a smattering of official-looking notes, she saw it, a child's crayon drawing, taped haphazardly. It was a brightly colored, abstract rendition of a house, complete with stick figures smiling under a lopsided sun. Leo's work, undoubtedly. It was so out of place in the sleek, formidable kitchen, a splash of innocent chaos in Roman's perfectly ordered world. Looking at that simple drawing, a poignant sign of the small boy's presence, she felt a strange shift within her. Roman Russo, the man who had locked her away, the formidable force who commanded an empire, was also a father. His cold pronouncements, his absolute control, were rooted in a fierce dedication. He was not just a captor, he was a protector. And in this strange, gilded prison, she was undeniably safe. The anger still simmered, but beneath it, a nascent, unsettling calm began to take root. The initial fire of Adriana's indignation had dulled, not extinguished, but banked by the sheer, unyielding force of Roman's will. She had argued, demanded, even pleaded, but his answers remained the same, cold, logical, and utterly final. There was no escape. Slowly, grudgingly, she began to accept the reality of her gilded cage. Resistance was a futile drain on her spirit, and she needed to conserve every ounce of it for Leo, for herself. Her days now took on a strange, opulent routine. She still cared for Leo, finding solace and purpose in his innocent presence. But her world had shrunk to the mansion's vast, polished confines. She watched, observed, and slowly, the true extent of Roman Russo's power began to unfold before her. She saw it in the way the staff moved around him, silent and efficient, anticipating his every need before he voiced it. A quiet nod from him, a brief, almost imperceptible gesture of his powerful hand, and doors opened, orders were carried out, and people scattered. She overheard hushed phone calls from his study, snippets of conversations that spoke of vast enterprises, of decisions that impacted countless lives, delivered in a voice that was always calm, always commanding. He spoke with an unshakable authority that left no room for question, no space for doubt. His world was a complex web of power, and he was undeniably at its very center, a dark star around which everything else orbited. Often, men in expensive suits, faces grim and watchful, would arrive and depart, their brief interactions with Roman filled with a silent, deferential respect that bordered on fear. Adriana would catch glimpses of these meetings, a knot tightening in her stomach. These were not simply business associates. They moved with an air of contained danger, their gazes sharp, their postures ready. Roman, in their presence, was even more formidable, a silent, immovable force. She understood then that the world he protected her from was not just dangerous, but actively hostile, violent, and far beyond anything she could ever comprehend or defend herself against. Yet within these walls, Roman provided. More than provided, he lavished. A personal shopper arrived with racks of designer clothes in her size, fabrics she had only ever dreamed of touching, an expensive new laptop, and access to all her online early childhood education courses were set up in her room, along with a personal tutor available for any questions. Her small, humble belongings were replaced with luxuries she'd never imagined. She had everything except choice. The frustration of that loss simmered beneath the surface, a constant, dull ache. But beneath that ache was also a profound, unsettling gratitude. Her old life had been a constant struggle for survival, a relentless battle against insecurity. Here, she was safe, utterly, undeniably safe. Roman rarely spoke directly to her outside of instructions regarding Leo, but she felt his gaze often. Sometimes she would be reading to Leo in the library or helping him with a puzzle, and she would sense him. She would look up and there he would be, standing silently in a doorway or across the vast room, watching them. His dark eyes would sweep over Leo, a softening, almost tender light in them, before settling on her. It was a gaze that was unreadable, intense, possessive. It made her skin prickle, a mix of unease and a strange, almost comforting heat. He wasn't just observing, he was assessing, absorbing, claiming. During one such moment, as she helped Leo build a towering block castle, she glanced up. Roman stood by the ornate fireplace, a phone pressed to his ear, his back to the room. But as if sensing her gaze, he slowly turned. His eyes met hers across the distance. He said nothing, simply watched. His large, powerful hand, holding the phone, was resting on the mantelpiece, and she noticed the heavy gold signet ring glinting dully under the chandelier's light. It was thick, solid, a symbol of ancient power and unyielding authority. The sight of it on his hand, the hand that controlled so much, that protected so fiercely, sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't just a ring, it was a mark, a declaration. And as his gaze held hers, she felt the unspoken weight of that declaration settle over her, a strange, potent mix of fear and an undeniable, growing sense of security. She was trapped, yes, but she was also undeniably under his protection, an unseen hand guiding her every step, shielding her from a world that would otherwise consume her. Adriana's initial anger, a fiery, desperate thing, had begun to cool, leaving behind a quiet acceptance, heavy as the mansion's velvet curtains. Her defiance, once a fierce roar against Roman's immutable command, had softened into a sigh, a reluctant understanding. She had fought for her freedom, for her right to choose, but Roman's cold, unwavering logic had proven undeniable. The world outside these formidable walls was not merely dangerous for her. It was a hungry beast, and she a fragile lamb. She still yearned for the simple autonomy of her old life, the ability to walk out the door without permission, to make her own choices, no matter how small. But that yearning was now tempered by a chilling memory. The crack of gunfire, the scent of gunpowder, the visceral terror of shielding Leo's small body. Roman hadn't lied, he had simply stated a brutal truth. And every day, the relentless vigilance of the guards, the impenetrable security, the hushed conversations among his men, whispered confirmation of the very real, very present threat that lurked beyond the iron gates. A strange, unsettling peace began to settle over Adriana. Her life before Roman had been a constant tightrope walk, a relentless battle against poverty, invisibility, and the ever-present fear of exposure. She had carried the burden of her undocumented status, the anxiety of making rent, the exhaustion of juggling multiple jobs, all while trying to build a future she could call her own. It had been a life of constant vulnerability, of being prey to circumstances beyond her control. Here, in this gilded cage, those fears had evaporated. She no longer worried about money, about shelter, about her next meal. Those anxieties, once constant companions, were now distant echoes. Roman's control, once a suffocating weight, now began to feel like a formidable shield. His possessiveness, which had initially felt like an absolute imprisonment, transformed in her mind into an unyielding protection. He didn't ask her opinion, he simply was. He was the unmoving mountain, the impregnable fortress, and she was simply within his walls. There was a profound, almost dizzying relief in no longer having to fight, to strive, to constantly look over her shoulder. His strength was absolute, and it was entirely directed at keeping her safe. When Roman's deep voice would issue a command, a simple instruction about Leo's schedule, or a quiet directive to remain in a certain part of the mansion, Adriana found herself obeying without conscious thought. It wasn't a forced compliance. It was an instinctive surrender to a greater, more capable power. And in that surrender, she discovered a peculiar kind of safety, When she yielded, the tension in her shoulders eased. When she submitted to his decisions, a calm, almost serene feeling would wash over her. It was as if her own anxieties were absorbed by his immense presence, her fears rendered impotent by his unwavering will. She began to trust his judgment, his strength, his absolute certainty. His dark eyes, which had once felt so cold and assessing, now seemed to hold a steadfast, unwavering vigilance. He saw the dangers, understood the threats, and dealt with them with a brutal efficiency that left no room for doubt. She didn't need to understand the intricacies of his world. She just needed to exist within the formidable bubble he had created. One evening, as a storm raged outside, rattling the thick glass of the mansion's windows, Adriana sat by the fire with Leo, reading a story. Roman entered the room, his towering figure filling the doorway, a silent sentinel against the tempest. He simply stood there, watching them, his presence a palpable force of calm in the wild night. Leo, sensing his father, looked up and smiled, a rare, uninhibited grin. Roman's gaze met Adriana's, and in that moment she felt it fully. A deep, quiet peace. She was trapped, yes, but she was also utterly, irrevocably safe, and for the first time in her life, that felt like enough. The fragile peace Adriana had found within the mansion's walls, a quiet acceptance born of Roman's formidable protection, began to fray. It wasn't Roman who disturbed it, nor anything within her gilded cage, but a subtle shift in the air, a tightening of the unseen threads that held her world together. The outside world, the one Roman had so definitively walled her off from, was stirring again, angry and relentless. She first noticed it in the eyes of the guards. They were always watchful, but now their gazes held a new, sharper edge, scanning every corner, every shadow, with an almost desperate intensity. Their movements became swifter, their posture more rigid. The low hum of surveillance equipment in the mansion seemed to grow louder, more insistent, a constant underlying thrum that vibrated through the silent halls. Whispers, faint at first, began to filter into her carefully constructed bubble. She would catch snippets of hushed conversations between Roman's men, their voices low and urgent, often ending abruptly when she inadvertently came into earshot. She heard words like perimeter breach, increased activity, and the chilling phrase, "They're still looking for her." A cold knot tightened in her stomach. The rival cartel hadn't forgotten her. They were frustrated by Roman's impenetrable defenses, and that frustration was making them bold. One evening, as she helped Leo put away his toys in the playroom, she heard it clearly. Two of Roman's most trusted men were speaking just outside the closed door, their voices rough with concern. "They hit the warehouse in Queens again," one growled. "A message. They want her out. They want Roman to break. They're getting desperate." The other man swore under his breath, a grim, weary sound. "They won't stop until they find a weakness, and she's still the weakest link." Adriana froze, her hand clenching around Leo's worn plush lion. The words were a physical blow, confirming her deepest fears. The danger was real. It was personal, and it wasn't going away. Her very existence within these walls was a provocation, a target painted on her back that Roman had inexplicably chosen to defend. The safety she had grown accustomed to suddenly felt precarious, a fragile shell constantly under assault. Roman's response was swift and absolute, an immediate tightening of the reins. The mansion, already a fortress, became even more impregnable. New security protocols were implemented, the guards doubled, their patrols more frequent, more thorough. She saw Roman himself move through the mansion with a heightened vigilance, his jaw set, his dark eyes like flint. He was a force of nature preparing for a storm, and she, Leo, and the entire compound were within his protective eye. He spoke to her directly, his voice low and unwavering, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "The threat has escalated. You are to remain within the main living quarters at all times, unless escorted by myself or my personal detail." His gaze held hers, an unspoken command for absolute obedience. "Do not question it. Do not deviate. I will not tolerate any risk." His voice, usually a deep rumble, now had an edge of steel, a warning not just to her, but to the unseen enemies pressing in. Adriana felt the tightening of her confinement, the sudden loss of even the limited autonomy she had carved out. But instead of anger, a strange, profound sense of relief washed over her. He wasn't punishing her, he was protecting her. His control wasn't about dominance for its own sake, but a primal, unyielding need to shield her from the brutal reality of his world. When he commanded, she felt a profound surge of safety, a conviction that his power, his ruthlessness, was the only thing standing between her and unimaginable harm. She found herself watching him even more closely. She saw him on the phone for hours, his voice calm but firm, orchestrating defenses, issuing orders that resonated with absolute authority. She witnessed him inspecting new security installations, his hand, with the heavy gold signet ring, resting on a reinforced doorframe, a symbol of unshakable resolve. Each action, each command, was a reinforcement of his unwavering promise. He would do anything to keep her safe inside these walls. The tension in the mansion was palpable, a constant thrumming beneath the surface, but it stemmed entirely from the external threat. From the world Roman was so fiercely holding at bay, and within the bubble of his absolute protection, Adriana felt a peculiar, terrifying, yet undeniable safety. The mansion, already a fortress, tightened its hold around Adriana, not with physical chains, but with an invisible web of Roman's absolute will. The external world's escalating threats had sharpened Roman's protectiveness into something overtly possessive, a tangible force that dictated her every breath. She felt it, not as a burden, but as a formidable presence, a constant, unblinking shield. Her movements, once confined, were now meticulously orchestrated. Roman dictated her schedule, her location, her very presence within the sprawling compound. She was never truly alone. A dedicated security detail, two silent, watchful men, now shadowed her every step, even within the mansion's most private spaces. If she moved from the library to the conservatory, they were there, a respectful distance behind, their eyes constantly sweeping, assessing, protecting. If she retired to her rooms for the night, she knew they were just outside her door, a silent, unwavering presence. The initial strangeness of this constant surveillance had faded, replaced by a deep, almost primal comfort. They were his eyes, his extensions, keeping her safe. She understood now that his commands weren't about asserting dominance for its own sake, but about ensuring her survival. When Roman's voice, a low, steady rumble, would issue an instruction, "Remain in the atrium this afternoon, or do not venture beyond the West Wing," she found herself obeying without question, without even a flicker of the old defiance. Her trust in him had solidified, a bedrock beneath the shifting sands of her fear. She had witnessed the raw, brutal efficiency of his world, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that his way was the only way to navigate it. His presence, too, became a constant, anchoring force. Even when he was not physically in the room, Adriana felt his pervasive control, his unwavering vigilance. He had cameras everywhere, discreetly placed, their silent lenses a testament to his pervasive watchfulness. She knew she was always within his line of sight, always under his heavy surveillance. It was a strange, almost intoxicating feeling, to be so utterly seen, so completely accounted for, so fiercely guarded. She would often catch glimpses of him, sometimes in the distance, standing by a window, his powerful frame silhouetted against the river, or walking through a corridor, his dark suit a stark contrast to the mansion's opulent surroundings. His gaze, when it met hers, was no longer merely assessing. It was deep, intense, and held an undeniable claim. There was a possessiveness in his dark eyes that made her skin prickle, a sensation that was both unnerving and profoundly reassuring. It was the look of a man who owned, who protected, who would permit no challenge to what was his. This shift in her perception was profound. His control was not about her submission as an individual, but about her safety as a treasure. He hadn't just locked her in. He had claimed her as his to protect. And in a world that had always felt precarious and indifferent, this absolute, unyielding claim was a lifeline. She saw his possessiveness not as imprisonment, but as a formidable shield, built of his strength, his ruthlessness, and his unwavering will. One afternoon, she was playing a quiet game with Leo in the vast playroom. The boy's soft laughter, a fragile counterpoint to the unspoken tension that still hummed beneath the mansion's surface. Roman entered, his footsteps almost silent on the thick carpet. He didn't speak, simply stood in the doorway, his immense presence filling the space. His gaze swept over Leo, a softening in his formidable features, then settled on Adriana. She felt the weight of it, the undeniable force of his protection, and in that moment a deep, quiet calm settled over her. The outside world continued its relentless hunt, but within these walls, under his unwavering watch, she was safe, and that safety, born of his absolute power, was everything. The tension that had quietly hummed beneath the mansion's polished surface suddenly snapped. Adriana felt it like a physical jolt, a cold wave washing over the previous evening. She hadn't seen anything directly, but she had heard it. A distant, muffled thud from the far side of the sprawling grounds, followed by a frantic, hushed flurry of activity. The guard's footsteps, usually silent, now echoed with a new urgency. Roman's voice, a low rumble even when calm, had cut through the night, sharper, more commanding than she had ever heard it. She had remained in her rooms with Leo, as instructed, the heavy door a meager barrier against the unknown chaos unfolding outside. He had ensured she was shielded, even from the sounds. Yet the air had thrummed with a raw, primal energy, a clear indication that the perimeter, her formidable shield, had been tested. The next morning an unsettling quiet hung over the mansion, a stillness more unnerving than any alarm. The guards were still there, still watchful, but their faces were grim, their eyes hollow with a night of vigilance. Adriana felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Something significant had happened. Later that day, while Leo was napping, Adriana found herself drawn to the immense windows of the conservatory, a room usually bathed in soft light and the scent of exotic plants. Today, the light felt muted, the air heavy. As she walked past a rarely used side door that led to one of the mansion's smaller, less frequented outbuildings, her gaze snagged on something small, a glinting on the pristine white gravel just beyond the threshold. Curiosity, morbid and irresistible, pulled her forward. She bent down, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was a small, ornate piece of metal, no larger than her thumb, intricately shaped like a snarling wolf's head, a symbol she had seen on discreet tattoos worn by some of Roman's more dangerous-looking visitors. Though never on Roman himself, it was clearly a deliberate calling card, left in a place designed to be found. A chilling message. They had been here. They had breached the outer layer of Roman's fortress, walking on the very grounds she now called home. A cold dread seeped into her bones, making her knees weak. The reality of the threat, of the relentless hunt for her, became terrifyingly tangible. She hurried inside, the wolf's head token clutched in her hand, her breath shallow and uneven. She wanted to tell Roman, to show him, but then she remembered his absolute control, his unwavering vigilance. He already knew. He always knew. The true, brutal cost of that knowledge struck her later that evening. She had walked down a secluded corridor near Roman's private wing, a hallway she rarely used, heading towards the library. The marble floor, usually gleaming with an almost blinding white purity, was marred. A dark, dried stain, a stark, unmistakable crimson, splattered across the brilliant white. It wasn't a large stain, but it was stark, chilling, and utterly horrifying. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes widening. Blood! Her mind recoiled, refusing to process the image, yet her gaze was locked on it. The marble, so perfect, so pristine, now bore the undeniable mark of violence. It wasn't fresh, suggesting it had happened hours ago, perhaps during the night, cleaned hastily but not thoroughly enough. Roman's men had dealt with the breach, swiftly, brutally. She hadn't seen it, but she was seeing the chilling aftermath, a stark, undeniable symbol of the lengths he went to keep the ugliness of his world from her. A wave of nausea washed over her, followed by a profound, almost dizzying sense of awe. This was the cost of her safety. This was the dark reality Roman inhabited, the gruesome acts he orchestrated, the violence he allowed, all to keep the monster at bay, all to ensure she remained untouched. He had shielded her from the direct brutality, but he couldn't shield her from its grim residue. She looked at the blood-speckled floor, then back at the heavy closed door of Roman's study further down the hall, where she knew he was working late. The image of his powerful hand, the heavy gold signet ring, flashed in her mind. His world was savage, unforgiving, yet he had built a sanctuary for her within it. The incident, horrifying as it was, solidified her reliance on him, deepening her understanding of the terrifying depths of his power and the absolute lengths he would go to protect what he claimed as his own. She might be a prisoner, but she was also a protected treasure, guarded by a man who wielded violence as easily as breath. And in that chilling realization, a profound, unsettling security settled over her, a dark comfort in his unyielding, brutal strength. The relative quiet of the mansion, a fragile illusion, shattered with a brutal suddenness that stole Adriana's breath. This wasn't a distant thud or a muffled echo like before. This was an invasion. The very foundations of the sprawling estate seemed to shudder, a deep, jarring vibration that resonated through the polished floors and up into her bones. Alarms shrieked, a piercing electronic wail, followed by the terrifying, unmistakable sound of heavy impacts against the mansion's fortified walls, as if giants were tearing at its stone skin. Adriana, who had been reading to Leo in the library, instinctively pulled the small boy close, her arms a desperate cage around him. Leo whimpered, his face buried in her side, clutching his worn plush lion with white knuckles. Before she could even process the full terror of the situation, Roman's voice, a raw, guttural roar unlike anything she had ever heard, ripped through the chaos. "Panic room, now!" It was a command, stripped of all pleasantries, pure and absolute, vibrating with a primal fury that sent a shiver down her spine. There was no room for question, no space for hesitation. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, propelled by an instinct born of fear and an ingrained obedience to his dominant presence. She scooped Leo into her arms, her legs burning as she sprinted through the ornate corridors, guided by the silent, urgent gestures of Roman's men, who seemed to materialize out of the shifting shadows. They reached a discreet, reinforced door, almost invisible in the wall paneling. One of Roman's men punched in a code, the heavy door hissing open to reveal a small, windowless chamber. It was Spartan, yet incredibly secure, insulated with thick soundproofing. She was pushed gently inside, Leo still clinging to her, and the door swung shut with a heavy, final thud, plunging them into a muffled, claustrophobic darkness. The silence inside was unnerving, a stark contrast to the maelstrom outside, yet it was not absolute. The thick walls absorbed most of the sound, but she could still feel the low, seismic thrum of the mansion, vibrating with the violence unfolding. Distant, muffled explosions reverberated through the floor, a deep, sickening boom that made her stomach clench. She heard the faint, staccato crack, crack, crack of automatic gunfire, distinct even through the layers of steel and concrete. This wasn't just an attack, it was a battle, and Roman was at its very heart. She held Leo tight, rocking him gently, whispering reassurances she barely believed herself. His small body trembled against hers, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Adriana pressed her cheek against his soft hair, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was terrified for him, for Roman, for the unknown fate of everyone outside this tiny, steel-lined sanctuary. As the muffled sounds of combat continued, a strange shift occurred within her. The terror was still there, a cold, persistent claw, but it was now overlaid with an awe so profound it was almost spiritual. She was insulated, yet she felt the storm, and she knew with absolute certainty that Roman was the eye of it. She imagined him out there, moving through the chaos, a towering, a terrifying force, his dark eyes burning with the same fury that had commanded her into this room. The very air, even within the sealed chamber, seemed to vibrate with his wrath, a palpable energy that was both terrifying and undeniably protective. He had anticipated this. He had set a trap. He was unleashing his full, terrifying power. A network of brutal efficiency she could only vaguely comprehend. The sounds she heard weren't just random violence. They were the symphony of his retaliation, the ruthless precision of his organization defending its territory, defending them. The sheer scale of his protection, the unparalleled lengths he would go to, pressed down on her. He had created this impenetrable fortress, not for himself, but for the vulnerable lives he had claimed as his own. He was fighting for her, for Leo, with a ferocity that bordered on madness. And in that terrifying realization, amidst the muffled echoes of war, a profound, unsettling security began to settle over her. His wrath was a shield, his violence a promise. She was terrified, yes, but she was also undeniably safe. And in the heart of that storm, protected by his brutal, unquestioning power, she found a strange, fierce peace. The mansion remained a place of hushed vigilance, even after the terrifying midnight assault. Though the immediate danger had passed, the air still crackled with a residual tension, like a storm that had retreated but left its electricity behind. Roman's men moved with a renewed purpose, their faces grim, their weapons more overtly visible. Adriana and Leo had been released from the panic room, but the echoes of gunfire and Roman's raw fury still vibrated in her memory. She found a strange, fierce strength in tending to Leo, in the quiet, mundane tasks of caring for him, trying to bring a fragile sense of normalcy back to their world. One afternoon, a few days after the attack, Adriana was helping Leo tidy his sprawling playroom. The room, usually a cheerful riot of color, felt subdued, reflecting the quiet solemnity of its small occupant. Leo, still a little withdrawn, was meticulously arranging his collection of toy cars, his plush lion never far from his side. Adriana knelt, gathering stray blocks and picture books, trying to engage him in gentle conversation. "What about this box, Leo?" she asked softly, indicating a small wooden chest tucked away under a shelf. It was a simple, unadorned box, slightly scuffed, clearly very old. Leo shrugged, a small, vague gesture. "Just my old things," he mumbled, not looking up. Adriana pulled it out, a faint curiosity stirring within her. It felt heavy, filled with untold memories. She opened the lid, revealing a jumble of childhood treasures. A small, smooth river stone, a handful of colourful marbles, a dried flower pressed between two worn pages of a storybook. And then, nestled at the very bottom, beneath a tangled string of beads, she saw it. An old, faded photograph. It was a small, sepia-toned picture, its edges soft and worn from countless touches. It showed a young woman, vibrant and smiling, holding a tiny, swaddled baby. The woman's eyes, even in the faded print, held a familiar sparkle, a mischievous glint that made Adriana's breath catch in her throat. Her heart gave a painful, lurching thump, then began to pound with a frantic, desperate beat. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, her gaze fixed on the woman's face. The smile, the curve of her jaw, the way her hair fell around her shoulders, it was undeniable, it was impossible. Yet it was undeniably true. This was Leo's mother. The woman Roman said had died. But this woman was also Adriana's sister, her own sister, Elena. Elena, who Adriana had believed died years ago, in a different city, under circumstances that had been vague and heartbreaking. Elena, who had supposedly left behind no children. Elena, whose memory was a ghost Adriana had learned to live with, a wound that had never quite healed. The world tilted on its axis. The playroom, the mansion, the very air around her seemed to spin. Leo's small, innocent face swam into view, then out again, replaced by the ghost of Elena's smile. This was Leo's mother, her sister's son. A wave of shock, so profound it was almost physical, washed over her, followed by a grief so sharp, so fresh, it stole the air from her lungs. Not only had her sister been alive longer than she knew, but she had a son. Their son, Leo. Confusion coiled in her gut, a sickening knot of betrayal and disbelief. Why hadn't she known? Why had Roman kept this from her? The pieces of her past, the memories of her sister, began to rearrange themselves in her mind, distorted and horrifying. The different circumstances of her sister's death, the vagueness that had always troubled her, now felt like a deliberate lie, a carefully constructed deception. She looked at the child in the photograph, a tiny bundle in Elena's arms, then at the small boy now quietly playing with his cars, oblivious to the earthquake that had just rocked her world. This child, whom she had loved and protected with such fierce tenderness, was her nephew, her blood. And Roman, the man who had imprisoned her, who dictated her every move, had known this all along. A cold, burning anger began to simmer beneath the grief and shock. Every moment of his possessive protection, every cold command, every assertion of control, suddenly felt tainted, layered with a secret she had a right to know. He hadn't just locked her in a mansion. He had locked her away from her own family, from a truth that belonged to her. She rose slowly, the faded photograph clutched tight in her hand, her knuckles white. Her gaze found Roman's study, a formidable fortress within the mansion's larger fortress. Her fear of him, her ingrained instinct to obey, vanished, replaced by a raw, desperate need for answers. The truth, now exposed, tore at her, leaving her exposed and vulnerable, yet utterly resolute. She walked out of the playroom, leaving a confused Leo with his cars, her footsteps echoing with a purpose she hadn't known until this moment. She would find Roman, and he would tell her everything. Adriana found Roman in his study, exactly where she expected him to be, surrounded by the dark wood and hushed power of his domain. The faded photograph, still clutched in her trembling hand, felt like a burning coal. Her fear, once a constant companion in his presence, had been consumed by a raging fire of shock, grief, and a bewildering sense of betrayal. She no longer felt small. She felt incandescent with a demand for truth. He looked up as she entered, his dark eyes, usually unreadable, narrowing almost imperceptibly as he registered the fierce determination in her posture, the raw emotion on her face. He saw the photograph. He knew. "Explain this," she demanded, her voice shaking but unwavering as she held out the picture of her sister Elena cradling baby Leo. The question wasn't really a question. It was an accusation, a desperate plea for clarity in a world suddenly turned upside down. Roman's gaze fixed on the photograph, then lifted to hers, unwavering. There was a flicker, deep within his dark eyes, of something she couldn't quite decipher. Not anger, not surprise, but perhaps a profound weariness, an acceptance of an inevitable reckoning. He stood, slowly, deliberately, his immense height dominating the room, making the air heavy with his silent presence. "Elena," he stated, his voice a low, steady rumble, devoid of inflection, yet carrying an immutable weight that pressed down on her. "She was your sister, and she was Leo's mother." The stark confirmation, though already known, hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Tears pricked at her eyes, blurring the formidable figure before her. "Why?" she whispered, the single word encompassing years of lies, of suppressed grief, of stolen family. "Why didn't I know? Why did you keep this from me?" He walked around his massive desk, stopping a few feet from her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was an almost physical force, enveloping her. "Your sister was entangled with dangerous individuals, Adriana," he began, his voice still calm, yet now laced with a chilling undertone. "The kind who leave nothing but wreckage. When she died, it was complicated, messy. The kind of mess that would have pulled you and Leo into the same darkness." He paused, his dark eyes holding hers, compelling her to listen, to understand the brutal logic of his world. "I erased her, from the police reports, from the public record. I took the murder charge myself, ensuring her name and yours would never be linked to that underworld. It was the only way to protect Leo, to give him a clean slate, and to keep you, her only remaining family, from being drawn in." Adriana stumbled back a step, reeling from the torrent of his words. He had taken a murder charge for Elena, to protect Leo, to protect her. The scale of his sacrifice, the cold, ruthless calculation of it, was breathtaking. He hadn't just orchestrated a cover-up, he had absorbed the sin, taken the burden of a crime onto himself, all to shield them. Her anger, so fierce moments ago, began to dissipate, replaced by a strange, profound gratitude that brought a fresh wave of tears. Roman's possessive protection, once an infuriating imprisonment, now took on a terrifying, selfless dimension. He hadn't just locked her away. He had taken on the weight of her entire family's shattered past, bearing it alone, so that she and Leo could simply exist, safe and untouched. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just a captor, but a formidable, unyielding protector whose devotion was absolute, brutal in its execution, yet undeniably pure in its intent. His power was absolute, and now she understood its true depth. It wasn't just about control, but about an unshakable, unwavering commitment to those he deemed his own. You did that," she whispered, the words catching in her throat, a fragile sound in the vast silence of the room. He simply nodded, his gaze unwavering, confirming the unthinkable. There was no apology, no softening of his formidable features, only the stark, undeniable truth of his actions. He had done what was necessary in his world with his power to ensure their survival. A shiver ran through her, not of fear, but of a profound, almost dizzying understanding. Her sister's son, her nephew, all these months she had been caring for her own family, protected by the man who had created an impenetrable shield around them both. The bond that had been slowly forming between her and Leo, between her and this mansion, now solidified, forged in the crucible of this brutal confession. She felt a strange, fierce strength bloom within her, replacing the last vestiges of her resistance. Her choices, her freedom, her control, they all seemed insignificant now, irrelevant against the backdrop of Roman's overwhelming, self-sacrificing protection. She hadn't been imprisoned. She had been saved, and in that terrifying, exhilarating realization, her bond to him, to Leo, to this strange, dangerous, yet utterly secure new home, became unbreakable. She was his, and he was theirs. The truth of Elena, of Leo, and of Roman's incredible, brutal sacrifice had irrevocably altered Adriana's world. The shock, the grief, the betrayal had all burned away, leaving behind a purified understanding, a fierce, unshakable loyalty. Roman wasn't just a captor, he was a shield. He hadn't just imprisoned her, he had saved her and her family from a darkness she couldn't begin to comprehend. This new clarity was a double-edged sword. It brought with it an even sharper awareness of the danger that still lurked beyond the mansion's walls. The quiet vigilance that had settled over the estate after the last breach now intensified, growing into a palpable hum of anticipation, a low thrum that vibrated through the very air. Roman moved with a heightened intensity, his formidable presence radiating an almost terrifying focus. She saw it in the way his men responded to him, their deference absolute, their movements sharp with urgency. He had learned somehow that the rival cartel, enraged and desperate, was planning a final, all-out assault on the mansion. It wasn't a possibility, it was an inevitability. The fortress was about to be tested one last time. Adriana felt the shift in Roman, a primal, contained energy that made him seem even larger, even more dangerous. He was preparing for war, and in this terrifying new reality she found her place. She was no longer a reluctant captive, but a steadfast anchor, a quiet strength within his storm. She watched him coordinate defenses, his voice a low, steady rumble on the phone, issuing orders that resonated with absolute authority. He walked the perimeter, inspecting every reinforced window, every new sensor, his powerful hand, the heavy gold signet ring glinting, resting on the cold steel of a newly installed security gate. His ruthlessness was a force of nature. But now, knowing its true purpose, Adriana felt only a profound, almost dizzying sense of safety in its shadow. Her focus shifted entirely to Leo. The boy, sensing the unspoken tension, had become quieter, clinging more to his worn plush lion. Adriana dedicated herself to keeping him calm, to maintaining a fragile semblance of normalcy in their small, secure world. She read him stories in the library, her voice soft and even, shielding him with her words as Roman shielded them with steel and fire. She helped him draw, his crayons creating bright, innocent worlds on paper, while outside, Roman prepared for a grim reality. When Roman issued instructions, they were no longer met with internal resistance, but with immediate, absolute compliance. "You will remain in the secure living quarters," he would say, his dark eyes holding hers, not asking but commanding. "Do not open any door unless explicitly told to. Do not stray from my men's sight." And she would simply nod, her trust in his power and judgment absolute. She knew he saw the full scope of the threat, understood its cunning, and had the merciless will to face it. Her obedience was not weakness. It was a conscious dedication, a silent vow of faith in his strength. One evening, as the last light bled from the sky, casting long, ominous shadows across the vast grounds, Roman came to the playroom where Adriana and Leo were building a block tower. His presence filled the room, heavy and potent. Leo looked up, his small face solemn, then instinctively reached for Adriana's hand. Roman's gaze swept over them, a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes before they settled on Adriana. "It will be tonight," he stated, his voice low, a deep current flowing beneath his words. "The final push." Adriana's breath caught, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. But she didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her own eyes steady, reflecting a quiet, fierce resolve. She understood the gravity of his words, the terrifying reality they portended. She simply nodded, her grip tightening on Leo's small hand. "We'll be ready," she whispered, her voice surprisingly strong. Roman's eyes held hers for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He turned then, his powerful frame filling the doorway for a moment before he disappeared, swallowed by the looming shadows of the mansion. He was going to face the storm. Adriana looked at Leo, then at the child's crayon drawing still taped to the fridge in the kitchen, a brightly colored house under a lopsided sun. Her fears were immense, but they were now dwarfed by an even greater certainty. Roman would protect them. He would protect their family. Her dedication to him, to his will, to his absolute power, solidified into an unshakable resolve. She would follow his every command, trust his every instinct, for she knew with every fiber of her being that he would protect them all. He was her formidable shield, her unyielding protector, and in the heart of the coming storm, she would be his unwavering anchor. The night swallowed the mansion whole, a velvet shroud drawn over the world. Adriana, huddled with Leo in the vast, glass-walled atrium, felt the silence stretch taut, brittle, like a string about to snap. Every shadow seemed to deepen, every whisper of wind outside the reinforced glass felt like a premonition. Leo, nestled against her, slept fitfully, his small hand still clutching the worn plush lion, his innocent breaths the only soft sound in the cavernous space. Roman had chosen this place, the atrium, with its soaring glass ceiling and walls, its apparent vulnerability, a perplexing choice, until Adriana remembered his cold, strategic mind. He had a plan. He always had a plan, and she, with a deep, unwavering trust, clung to that knowledge. Then the string snapped. It began not with a bang, but with a shudder. A deep, resonant thrum that vibrated up from the marble floor, through her bones, rattling the very air. The mansion groaned, a sound like a wounded beast, and then the cacophony erupted. A piercing, guttural roar of alarms tore through the night, a metallic scream that shattered the silence. It was immediately followed by the terrifying, unmistakable sounds of war. Explosions ripped through the darkness outside, concussive blasts that made the glass walls around them flex and tremble. Adriana gasped, pressing Leo closer, shielding his head instinctively, even though she knew these walls were designed to withstand far more. The world outside the atrium became a chaotic maelstrom of flashing lights, orange and red, illuminating the frantic, desperate movements of Roman's men beyond the glass. Gunfire, sharp staccato cracks, the heavy, rhythmic thud of automatic weapons. Shouts, guttural and raw, echoing through the vastness of the mansion, growing closer, more urgent. It was everywhere, a symphony of destruction orchestrated by an unseen, malevolent force. The enemy had come. They had breached the outer layers. Adriana's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming noise. Her breath hitched, shallow and rapid. Leo stirred, whimpering, his small body tensing. She whispered his name, pulling him even tighter, burying her face in his hair, trying to absorb the terror, to make herself a solid, unwavering anchor in the storm. Through the glass, she saw fleeting glimpses of Roman's men, moving with brutal efficiency, returning fire, their faces grim, their movements precise. But the sheer volume of the assault, the relentless, unyielding press of the enemy, was terrifying. She could feel the mansion itself fighting, groaning under the assault, its formidable defenses straining against an overwhelming tide. And then she saw him. A shadow against the chaos, a towering, dark figure moving with impossible speed and terrifying grace. Roman. He was not with them in the atrium, as she had half hoped, half feared. He was out there in the thick of it, a vengeful angel of death moving through the mansion's inner corridors. She caught only glimpses, flashes of his dark suit, the glint of steel in his powerful hand, the ruthless precision of his movements. He was everywhere at once, a formidable force personally leading the defense, eliminating threats with a chilling efficiency that sent a shiver down her spine. His voice, when she heard it, was a distant, commanding roar, cutting through the gunfire and the shouts. It was stripped of all warmth, all inflection, pure, absolute command, vibrating with a primal, untamed fury. It was the sound of a predator unleashed, a force of nature protecting its territory, its young, and her. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence, a dark blur against the flashes of light. He was eliminating threats, personally. The thought, chilling as it was, brought with it a strange, unsettling sense of calm. He was fighting. He was protecting. He was doing what he did best. The sounds of combat, though still deafening, began to feel less like random chaos and more like a brutal, orchestrated ballet. Roman was conducting it. He was moving, commanding, killing, all for them, all to keep the world outside from touching her and Leo. She pressed her eyes shut, wishing she couldn't hear, couldn't feel the vibrations, but the knowledge of his presence, his formidable power, was an anchor. He was out there, and he would not fail. Her safety, Leo's safety, rested entirely on his terrifying strength, his absolute, unquestioning will. And in the heart of that midnight assault, she surrendered completely to it, a profound, terrifying trust blooming in the chaos. The glass walls of the atrium, which had until now felt like a formidable, albeit transparent shield, suddenly exploded inward. The terrifying crack of reinforced glass, shattering under impact, was deafening, a cascade of sharp shards spraying across the polished marble floor. A rush of cold night air, acrid with the smell of smoke and gunpowder, swept through the space, stealing Adriana's breath. Intruders, dark figures moving with brutal intent, poured into the atrium, their weapons raised, their faces grim shadows distorted by the flashing emergency lights. Adriana screamed, a raw, choked sound, pulling Leo's small body even tighter against her. He cried out, his fear a tiny, sharp spear in her chest. She curled over him, making herself as small as possible, a desperate, futile barrier against the overwhelming force that had breached their last sanctuary. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of terror, every nerve ending screaming, every instinct demanding retreat. But there was nowhere to go. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable, her body trembling violently. Then a presence, not a whisper, not a shadow, but a roaring storm, a force of nature unleashed. Roman. He was there, a towering, enraged figure, appearing from the chaos like a vengeful god. His dark suit was a blur of motion, his powerful frame moving with a terrifying speed that defied his immense size. He didn't speak, but his rage was a palpable entity, a wave of incandescent fury that seemed to scorch the air. He was magnificent in his wrath, an unstoppable force of brutal precision. He placed himself directly between Adriana, Leo, and the encroaching attackers. His body, vast and unyielding, became a living shield, eclipsing all else. He moved with a terrifying grace, his powerful hand, the heavy gold signet ring glinting, unleashing a storm of its own. The sharp crack of his own weapon was deafening, absolute. Assailants fell, their forms crumpling with brutal efficiency, their weapons clattering uselessly to the floor. The violence was swift, overwhelming, and absolute, orchestrated by a single, terrifying will. Adriana felt the impact of something striking Roman's broad back, a dull thud that vibrated through her, but he didn't flinch, didn't waver. He simply continued, a relentless, unstoppable machine of protection. She was pressed against him, his sheer mass a comforting, impenetrable fortress, his scent of expensive leather and gunpowder filling her lungs. The sheer force of his presence, his unwavering determination, drove back the fear. replacing it with a profound, almost dizzying sense of safety. He was a wall of muscle and will, standing between them and death, absorbing every blow, deflecting every threat. She could feel the tremors of his power, the raw, untamed strength of him, and in that moment she knew she was untouchable. He was a god of war, and he fought for her. The sounds of combat, which had been a deafening roar, began to recede. The sharp reports of gunfire lessened, then faded, replaced by the guttural groans of fallen men. The chaos subsided, leaving behind a chilling silence, broken only by Leo's soft whimpers and Adriana's own ragged breaths. Roman stood over them, his broad shoulders still squared, his weapon held loosely but ready, his dark eyes sweeping the atrium, assessing, ensuring. There was no one left standing but them. Then, faint at first, but growing steadily louder, came the wail of sirens from outside the mansion, a distant, mournful cry that signaled the end of the immediate threat. The police. Roman's gaze, still blazing with a formidable intensity, softened almost imperceptibly as it settled on Leo, then on Adriana. The air around them began to clear, the acrid scent of gunpowder slowly dissipating. Adriana heard it then, a low, mechanical groan, her head lifted, her gaze drawn, as if by an invisible string, beyond the shattered glass, past the blood-flecked marble, to the distant, towering iron security gates. Slowly, inexorably, with a deep hydraulic sigh, they began to swing open. Freedom. The open gates, once the symbol of her lost autonomy, of the life she'd so desperately craved, now seemed alien, distant, cold. She looked at them, a path to the outside world, to a past that felt impossibly far away. Then her gaze shifted. It moved from the open gates to Roman, who stood before her, battle-worn but victorious, immense and absolute. His dark suit was torn, a faint smear of blood on his cheek, but his presence was a towering, unyielding testament to his power, his protection, his undeniable claim. He had shielded her, risked everything, become a brutal, magnificent force to keep her safe. Without hesitation, without a single thought of the world beyond those gates, Adriana turned fully to him. She released Leo, who immediately clung to Roman's leg, and reached up, wrapping her arms around Roman's powerful waist, burying her face in his chest. His body, still radiating the heat of battle, was solid, unyielding, an anchor in her shattered world. "Home," she whispered, the single word muffled against his chest, but vibrating with every ounce of her soul, every truth she had found in the heart of his storm. This mansion, this gilded cage, this terrifying, powerful man, this was her home. It was absolute, it was safe, it was everything. The sirens faded, their mournful wail swallowed by the vast, recovering mansion. The iron gates, which had swung open to offer a glimpse of a world Adriana no longer recognized, now stood as a silent, unmoving monument to her choice. She was inside, and as Roman's powerful arms came around her, holding her against his hard, reassuring chest, she knew, with an absolute certainty that settled deep in her soul, that this was where she belonged. The mansion was secured, the last echoes of the brutal assault fading into the pre-dawn quiet. Roman's men moved through the atrium, grim-faced but efficient, assessing the damage, their movements a silent testament to the night's violence. Leo, exhausted and still trembling, was gently led away by one of the housekeepers, his worn plush lion clutched tight, leaving Adriana and Roman in the eerie, hushed aftermath. Roman's dark suit was torn, a faint smear of blood streaked across his cheek, another on his knuckles. He was formidable even in disarray, his immense presence still radiating a potent, untamed power. Adriana, her own body still trembling from the terror, felt an instinctive need to tend to him. It wasn't a request, it was an unspoken command from deep within her, a primal urge to soothe and care for the man who had just risked everything for her. She found a first aid kit, her hands surprisingly steady as she returned to him. He stood by the shattered remnants of the glass wall, looking out at the first sliver of dawn painting the sky, his back to her. She approached him slowly, cautiously, her gaze drawn to the angry graze on his powerful forearm. "Let me," she whispered, her voice a soft, almost reverent sound in the vast, damaged room. He didn't move, didn't speak, simply allowed her. His stillness was a profound acceptance, a quiet permission that sent a strange warmth through her. She reached for his arm, her fingers gentle as she cleaned the wound, her touch firm but feather-light. His skin was warm beneath her fingertips, hard with muscle, a testament to the strength that had just shielded them all. He watched her, his dark eyes intense, unreadable, yet she felt no judgment, only an unwavering gaze that held her completely. There was no need for words between them. The night had solidified everything. Her earlier anger, her desperate yearning for a freedom that had only ever brought her vulnerability, had completely dissolved. In its place was an absolute, unshakable trust, a profound acceptance of his will, his control, his formidable protection. She had seen the true face of the world he moved in, and she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that his way was the only way she could ever truly be safe. His gaze dropped from her face to her hands, still working gently on his arm. "You are safe," he stated, his voice a low rumble, deep and steady, echoing the immutable declaration she had heard months ago. But this time, it wasn't a decree of imprisonment. It was a vow, a promise forged in fire and blood, absolute and eternal. Adriana looked up, meeting his dark eyes. She saw the possessiveness there, stark and unyielding. But now it felt less like a cage and more like a cherished possession, something precious and fiercely guarded. Her role was not one of imprisonment, but of being treasured, protected, claimed. She knew, with every fiber of her being, that she was his to protect, and that was all she truly needed. Later that morning, as the mansion was slowly, methodically being restored, a quiet normalcy began to creep back in. Leo, miraculously resilient, was back to playing in the still intact playroom, his worn plush lion a steadfast companion. Adriana walked past the industrial-sized fridge in the kitchen, and there it was, still taped haphazardly, Leo's crayon drawing, a brightly colored, lopsided house under a smiling sun. It was a poignant symbol, a testament to the new family forged in the crucible of Roman's violence and his terrifying, absolute love. She thought of her sister Eleanor and the truth that had shattered her world only to rebuild it on stronger foundations. Roman had carried that burden, that dark secret to protect them. He had absorbed the world's brutality, becoming a monster to keep her and Leo untouched. And in doing so, he had given her not just safety, but a home, a purpose, and a fierce, undeniable belonging she had never known possible. Her life was no longer her own, not in the way she had once understood it. It was intertwined with his, protected by his immense power, dictated by his unyielding will. But in that surrender, in that profound acceptance, she found a peace deeper than any she had ever dreamed of. She was his undeniably, and in his world, under his absolute dominion, she was more cherished, more secure than she had ever been. Months later, the heavy iron gates of the mansion no longer felt like a barrier trapping Adriana, but a formidable embrace, sealing her within a world uniquely her own. She had not merely adjusted, she had blossomed. The anxious girl who once traced the frayed cuff of her jacket was gone, replaced by a woman who moved with a quiet confidence through the mansion's opulent halls, her steps light, her gaze steady. Her days were now filled with a different kind of purpose, one she had built within Roman's formidable compound. A large, sun-drenched wing of the mansion had been transformed into a small, exclusive playroom school. Laughter, bright and uninhibited, now echoed through rooms once filled with a hushed silence. Leo, thriving under her devoted care, was often found at the heart of the joyful chaos, his worn plush lion always nearby. A few carefully selected children, trusted by Roman's inner circle, joined them, their innocent presence fostering a sense of normalcy and warmth that Adriana cherished. She taught, she nurtured, she created a haven of learning and joy, all under Roman's watchful, all-encompassing protection. She was no longer just a nanny. She was the heart of this small, vibrant world, loved and guarded like royalty. Roman saw to her every need, anticipated her every unspoken wish. Designer clothes filled her closets, not as a luxury to tempt her, but as a silent testament to her cherished status. Her studies continued, facilitated by the best tutors and resources, ensuring her mind remained as engaged as her heart. She lived a life of unimaginable comfort, a stark contrast to the precarious existence she had known, and every comfort, every security, was a gift from his powerful hand. Roman's presence, immense and absolute, was a constant in her life. He often visited the playroom, his towering figure filling the doorway, his dark eyes sweeping over the children, then settling on Adriana with an intensity that made her skin prickle, with a familiar mix of reverence and a deep, settling calm. His voice, a low rumble even when soft, held an immutable command that she now instinctively obeyed. Not out of fear, but out of a profound, unwavering trust. His decisions were her decisions, his will her guidance, and in that absolute surrender she found a peace she had never known. His rule over New York's docks had only intensified, his grip even more absolute, his methods more ruthless. She rarely saw the harsh realities of his world, but she felt its distant reverberations, knowing that his power, honed and sharpened, was constantly at work, ensuring the safety of his domain. His brutality, once a terrifying unknown, was now a comfort, a formidable shield that protected her. She knew with an absolute certainty that any violence, any ruthlessness he wielded, was now entirely reserved for anyone who dared to look at his nanny-turned-queen the wrong way. The thought brought a shiver, but it was a shiver of profound security, of being utterly untouchable under his dominion. She would watch him from a distance sometimes, his powerful hand, the heavy gold signet ring glinting, resting on a polished banister or commanding silence in a meeting. His raw, untamed strength was a palpable force, and she, Adriana, was at the very center of its protective radius. She had found her true home not in a quiet life of her own choosing, but in the heart of his kingdom, under his absolute, unquestioning dominion. Her purpose was clear, her place secure, her safety everlasting. This mansion, once a gilded cage, was now her sanctuary, and Roman Russo, the Mafia boss who had locked her in, was her protector, her sovereign, her very life. She was his, and she was finally truly safe. If you enjoyed this story, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to Tales of Power and Desire to keep up with our intense romances.